кандидат пробеди, и ви били полезни. Спасибо большое, товарищ.
If you've been following the news lately, you've been hearing a lot about a certain country.
And it was paid for with rubles from Russia.
Namely that we were attacked. This was a very serious attack against the United States by a hostile foreign power, an attack against our election process.
One meddling effort that bridged everything from Facebook and Twitter to YouTube, Tumblr, and even Pokemon Go.
Watch too much cable news and you might start to believe that the Russian Federation is responsible for everything wrong with America. Every day on TV and in major newspapers, CIA, NSA, FBI spooks say that Russia is waging a sophisticated counterintelligence campaign to incite division and discord across all layers of society. There is an intense, ongoing propaganda campaign to convince us that Russia is our mortal enemy, and the rhetoric is getting a little heated.
Following attacks like Pearl Harbor, 9/11, U.S. presidents have rallied the country and the world to address the challenges facing the nation. Yet today, the current president of the United States still barely acknowledges the threat posed by Mr. Putin's repeated attacks on democratic governments and institutions.
This new Red Scare has real-world consequences. Russia and the US have both announced recently that they're going to be expanding their nuclear arsenals, reversing decades of progress towards disarmament and non-proliferation. And with both countries waging proxy wars in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, it isn't unthinkable that this might lead to an apocalyptic conflict. Personally, I feel like I've been taking goddamn crazy pills watching this unfold over the last year and a half. This notion of the resurgent Russia as a sinister empire with hegemonic ambitions, it just doesn't have any basis in reality. And I know this for a fact because I lived in Moscow and I worked for Russia's main state news agency.
If a person defends the activities of communist nations while consistently attacking the domestic and foreign policy of the United States, he may be a communist.
But first, some backstory. By mid-2012, I had been working as a website producer for CNN here in Atlanta for close to 2 years.
Now I look like I went to college.
My coworkers were nice enough, but the working conditions were miserable. I was making a crappy hourly wage as a full-time contractor, basically not much better than a fast food or retail worker. This meant that I had all the responsibilities of a full-time employee, but with no benefits, no healthcare, and no time off. And since Georgia is a right-to-work state, they could fire my ass anytime they wanted to, and for any reason, which I saw happen to more than a few people. So if you want to know why CNN produces its particular brand of journalism...
Those were legitimate.
Those were Russians.
They were not Russians. I don't go with the Russians.
That group was Russian.
I have nothing to do with the Russians.
Well, apparently you did.
No.
Maybe you didn't know it, but you did.
It's because they treat most of their employees like Uber treats its drivers. But then, the Russians came calling. Thanks to a friend's recommendation, I was offered a job in Russia working as a website editor for RIA Novosti, basically the BBC of Russia, and RT, formerly Russia Today. They offered me a fat paycheck, healthcare, paid vacation, and relocation expenses for the adventure of a lifetime in Moscow. So what do you think I did? Now, I'll be brutally honest with all of you. A lot of my year and a half in Russia was spent drinking and playing Hotline Miami. But I also spent a lot of time just absorbing my surroundings. I strolled the gorgeous parks of the Bulvarnoye Koltso and the other ring roads of central Moscow. I witnessed the country's abiding appreciation for art and culture at the Tretyakov Gallery and the Bolshoi Theater. I pondered the solemn melancholy of faded Soviet glory among the ruined statues of Monument Park. And I felt the weight of hundreds of years of history as I walked the palatial gardens of the Tsar's royal estate at Kolomenskoye. All those moments. Amidst all this beauty, I also saw a lot of ugliness. Even in a relatively rich city like Moscow, poverty was rampant. There was a clear and unmistakable division between the haves and the have-nots. Drug addiction and alcoholism were so common that they quickly became just another fact of life. And there was a distinctly dystopian edge to my time there, with uniformed police officers and surveillance cameras monitoring every street corner. At work, I was pleasantly surprised by how I was treated at RIA and RT. And let's be clear, I knew exactly what I was getting into. I was editing and producing English language news in order to paint Russia in a positive light, while also exposing the wrongdoings of the governments of Europe and the US. But ironically, or maybe not, I had far more editorial freedom working for Kremlin-controlled outlets than I ever had at CNN. I was given free rein and minimal oversight both on the kinds of stories I assigned and the editing I did for the writers who worked under me. That was a stark contrast to my time at CNN, where more than once I got to experience the joy of having a piece killed because of corporate censorship. There was also a refreshing willingness on the part of RIA and RT to cut through the bullshit and publish important news that other outlets refused to touch. A perfect example of this from when I was there in 2012 and 2013 was Jeremy Scahill's reporting on the covert US-Saudi war in Yemen. Mainstream US media just refused to cover this conflict, and we're still seeing the consequences. When I left Russia and returned to the US in late 2013, I was severely depressed for a long while. Not because of culture shock or because living in Russia was so remarkably different from the US. No, it was because of how similar our two countries are. I found modern Russia to be just as dysfunctional as America, and for the exact same reasons. Russian politics is every bit as nationalistic and militaristic as in the US. Thanks to an unholy alliance between powerful mega businesses and government, their domestic media, like ours, is a constant stream of propaganda and disinformation. Political discontent is exploited and redirected into loathing for minorities, intellectuals, gender nonconformity, and other outsiders. There's constant rhetoric about the threats looming just across the border, whether that's immigrant Muslims from Central Asia or the ring of NATO bases encircling Russia. President Putin's entire political platform has always been, basically, make Russia great again. During my time there, it became clear to me that the impoverishment and social collapse I saw in Russia was eventually going to play out at home. I just didn't expect it was going to happen quite so quickly. After the 2016 election broke everyone's brain, the Russian meddling conspiracy has become a kind of dark mirror to the birth certificate conspiracy that emerged after President Obama's landslide victory in 2008. It allowed his opponents to convince themselves the newly elected president was illegitimate, in order to avoid dealing with the cognitive dissonance staring them in the face. America is not the country they thought it was. Russian meddling is the birth certificate conspiracy for centrists and liberals, and for the exact same reasons. It's no coincidence that the sitting US president launched his campaign by promoting the birth certificate conspiracy, and that his opponents are now attempting to use the Russian meddling conspiracy to unseat him. Our country is in a spiral of deadlock and dysfunction while serious domestic issues go unaddressed. The US has been meddling, often violently, in foreign governments for as long as we've been a country. The notion that we're supposed to lose our minds over $100,000 in Facebook ads and a dozen shitposting trolls from St. Petersburg? It'd be funny if the consequences weren't so serious. Let's be completely clear about this. After a year and a half of obsessive focus on this story, there's still no proof or even evidence that Russia had any sort of meaningful impact on the 2016 election. And oh, what a joy it has been to see my former employer held up as the crown jewel of Russian strategic messaging. I've had dinner with some of the senior Russian managers at RT, and when I asked, they were very candid about why the channel really exists. They'll give space and airtime to just about anyone, regardless of their politics, who's willing to be critical of the current Western neoliberal consensus. Everyone from serious and respected intellectuals to depraved loudmouths. They have no loyalty to any single US party or politician, and they don't even have a particularly sophisticated understanding of how American politics actually works. Russia's English language news also isn't really intended for other countries, not in the main. It's for the domestic Russian audience. By pointing out the lies, contradictions, and hypocrisies of the supposedly enlightened democratic West, the current regime makes itself more legitimate. Don't trust the siren song of Western liberalism, they say. They can't even keep their own shit together. And we're seeing this trend repeat itself all over the globe. With the US in decline as an imperial power, America is retreating from its leadership position on the world stage, and countries like Russia and China are filling the power vacuum. Did you know that right now, China has been quietly undertaking a massive project to integrate Europe, Africa, and Asia into a unified infrastructure system with Beijing at its heart? You won't read about it in US news, but you will on RT. The last time I can recall a nationwide propaganda campaign this intense was during the run-up to the Iraq War, and we all know how that turned out. But at the root of things, here's what really bothers me the most about the conversation around Russia. This narrative of outside meddling will eventually be turned against some of the very same people cheering it on. I've seen it happen. I was at the Komovniki District Court for Pussy Riot's show trial in the summer of 2012. And I saw how Russian media used the outpouring of Western support for the punk group as evidence of a foreign conspiracy meant to discredit the Russian government. And the domestic audience mostly seemed to accept this explanation. Here in the US, we're all making funny jokes on Twitter about Russia and having a nice little laugh because the current president is such a hated figure. But this narrative will be used to silence any and all viewpoints outside of the mainstream, and we're starting to see this play out right now.
At least one of the ads that was bought by this Russian troll farm on Facebook was a Black Lives Matter ad that was targeted specifically to the cities of...
This country is upside down. Right-wingers now sound like 1960s radicals, railing against our shadowy intelligence agencies and the deep state. Centrists and liberals sound like Joe McCarthy and are abandoning their principles in their rush to embrace the same neoconservative spooks and war criminals responsible for the bloody disaster that is the US Mideast policy. The US elite hates Russia because Russia is us. Russia's government shows how authoritarianism can take root within a supposedly democratic framework. Representative government can easily be subverted to disempower and disenfranchise citizens, even while technically allowing us to vote. If you're wondering how something like this might happen in the US, the monstrous concentration of wealth and power in tech and finance is as good an example as any. For decades, Americans have been bombarded with anti-Russian propaganda across politics and entertainment. The recent narrative about Russian meddling is just one more link in a long chain. And for their part, the people currently in power in Russia are only too happy to play the role they've been assigned, since it gives them legitimacy. This conspiracy theory also benefits certain political factions in the US who can use it to rationalize or explain away a particularly embarrassing defeat in the 2016 elections. I left Russia because RIA Novosti closed down, and RT started going hard on publishing conspiracy theories and bullshit culture war nonsense. But I can't escape it, because now the Russian conspiracy theory is all around me. And when I look in the mirror, I see a living embodiment of American dysfunction staring back at me. But I know one thing for certain. Russia is not the enemy.
I'm afraid of Americans. I'm afraid of the world. I'm afraid I can't help it. I'm afraid I can't.
The foibles of politics and the march of time can turn friends into enemies just as easily as the wind changes. Ridiculous, isn't it? Yesterday's ally becomes today's opposition. And this Cold War? Think back. When I was leading the Cobras, America and Russia were fighting together. Now, consider whether America and Russia will still be enemies in the 21st century. Somehow I doubt it. Enemies change along with the times, the flow of the ages, and we soldiers are forced to play along.